2. Is competition inevitable? The human nature myth. Of all the vulgar modes of escaping from the consideration of the effect of social and moral influence on the human mind, the most vulgar is that of attributing the diversities of conduct and character to inherent natural differences. John Stuart Mill, Principles of Political Economy. Playing the human nature card. Those who argue most vigorously that competition is desirable are often the same people who assert that it is part of human nature. It is not only good that we try to best each other, it is inevitable. Strictly speaking, of course, the second contention cancels out the first. There is little point to debating whether we should be what we unavoidably are. From the perspective of a critic of competition, though, it is necessary to demonstrate that we do not have to be competitive before showing why we ought not to be. This chapter's task, then, is to scrutinize the widely accepted but rarely defended claim that competition is inevitable. In doing so, it makes sense to begin with the larger issue of inevitability itself. What is involved in the claim that a given attribute is part of human nature? Can such a claim be substantiated? Who benefits from this position? After addressing these questions, we can go on to consider the particular issue of competition. There are two versions of the human nature argument. The first claims that differences among particular groups of humans are innate. For instance, if women, men, or whites and non-whites are treated differently in a particular society, this is said to be a function of biology. This position purports to show that various findings in evolutionary biology and genetics prove that sexist and racist practices are unavoidable if not positively adaptive. The second kind of human nature argument, the one with which this chapter is concerned, says that particular characteristics are an unavoidable part of being human. These characteristics are said to be inborn rather than learned, part of nature rather than nurture. This debate has been going on for some time, and in each generation a new crop of scientists arises to carry the torch for biological determinism. A generation ago, Cyril Burt offered proof that intelligence was chiefly a function of genes. His evidence turned out to be fabricated, but it is interesting to note how long he was able to get away with his claims and how many of his conclusions continued to be accepted long after his data were proved worthless. Today, biological determinism is championed primarily by certain neurobiologists and psychiatrists on the one hand, and by the school of sociobiology that has grown up around Edward O. Wilson on the other. Most often, though, human nature is invoked in a casual way to account for various behaviors we encounter. Almost anything that we regularly come across is assumed with a shrug to describe the human condition. Interestingly, the characteristics that we explain away in this fashion are almost always unsavory. An act of generosity is rarely dismissed on the grounds that it is just human nature. Apart from the empirical grounds for defending such claims, though, it is important to remember that the burden of proof falls heavily on someone who asserts that a given characteristic is part of our nature. It is he or she who must provide compelling evidence to substantiate such a belief, and not the rest of us who must prove it is not so. Anyone who offers an assertion for our consideration has such a burden, but it is that much more formidable when the claim is absolute. To say that a given characteristic is in our nature is to assert that it is a feature of all human beings, across all cultures and throughout human history. Moreover, it is to propose its inescapability for all humans in the future. Has the human nature argument actually been proved? It is hard to tell because there is no single argument. Human nature really is an expression of commonality among many different schools of thought as applied to many different characteristics. It is a full-time undertaking to determine whether even a single attribute is an inescapable feature of human life. It would appear that the empirical evidence does not begin to support most such claims, but I cannot hope to rehearse this evidence here. Fortunately, others have done so and have shown the weaknesses of biological determinism in its many incarnations. In fact, it is difficult to know how one could ever prove decisively that something is part of human nature, given the theoretical complexity of such disputes. Many of us assume that all questions to which scientists address themselves admit of a definitive answer once the evidence has been assembled. If we want to know whether schizophrenia has a genetic basis, for example, we assume we can simply collect the data, see what they say, and move on to the next question. This common-sense view of how science works probably comes from high school science courses, which represent the field about as well as civics courses represent what actually goes on in politics. We were never taught about controversies over how a scientific dispute is to be framed, the various uses to which certain terms are put, the debates over the applicability and significance of particular findings. Data are not simply collected but interpreted, and how they are interpreted depends on what is counted as evidence as well as one's positions on other theoretical questions. If in contemporary physics, the hardest of sciences, one rarely settles a question to everyone's satisfaction by performing an experiment, this is all the more true when humans are the subject matter. Even the sociobiologists admit that the idea that there are certain genes which determine our behavior is merely fanciful speculation at this point. Critics ask whether such genes in principle could ever be found, if human behavior results from a complicated interrelationship among genes, and then again between genes and social forces. The enterprise of sociobiology is misconceived from the start. Let us say, for example, that someone sought to demonstrate that it is human nature to be aggressive. How could this be done? Providing evidence that aggression is universal would be a necessary, but not sufficient, step in such a proof. Even here, moreover, people of good faith might well disagree about what constitutes aggression and whether it really exists in a given culture. These considerations have to do with the truth or falsity of claims about human nature. But we should not ignore the uses to which such claims are put. It is true that an empirical dispute is not resolved by illuminating the functions served by one argument or the other. Still, it is altogether appropriate to ask of any argument, cui bono? Who benefits? Arguments to the effect that something is unavoidable, and claims about human nature, in particular, are typically offered in defense of the status quo. Now one may question whether advocates of biological inevitability intend to retard change. One may even question whether findings in support of this position enjoy acceptance largely because of their political implications. What is beyond dispute, however, is the practical consequence of such a perspective. Who benefits from the belief that unregulated capitalism is natural, or the belief that any feature of the status quo follows from something intrinsic to our makeup? Clearly it is those who are well served by that status quo. The human nature argument has the effect of blunting change, and it is played for all its rhetorical advantages. Ideals and reforms are opposed on the ground that they are impossible to attain, that they fly in the face of the givens of life. Your idea is charming, but unfortunately it's just human nature to be greedy / aggressive / competitive / territorial / lazy / stubborn, so it hasn't much chance to succeed. While undesirability, a matter of value, is debatable, impossibility, a matter of fact, is not. In the name of realism, uncounted ideas have been dismissed and their creators along with them, a phenomenon that we will consider again in the last chapter. Finally, I should observe that the human nature position is also an appealing one for psychological reasons. When we are criticized for an attitude we hold, it is tempting to respond, "Look, this is the way I was brought up." This is sometimes an appeal to cultural relativism, whose subtext is, "Who are you to judge?" But it is more often an appeal to determinism that argues, "I cannot choose to believe otherwise. If I cannot change, there is no point in arguing that I should. There is no shortage of putative causes for our behavior or values that can be used to deflect criticism." The almost limitless range of behaviors currently being tied to neurotransmitters offers a new set of excuses to supplant those provided by psychoanalysis. People used to say, "It's not my fault. My parents did it to me." Now they say, "It's not me. It's a biochemical disorder in my brain." Far more attractive than such rationalizations, however, is the claim that no human could be expected to act otherwise. Even when we are not directly challenged to defend our behavior, the prospect that our actions or attitudes may be inevitable is attractive. Freedom can be unsettling if not positively terrifying, and scientific determinisms are, psychologically speaking, the contemporary counterpart to theological doctrines of predestination. To be relieved of responsibility can, paradoxically, be experienced as freeing. Finally, the discomfort contemporary Americans have with value judgments can create a strong incentive to resort to arguments that certain things must be. In several respects, then, the human nature argument, which is virtually impossible to substantiate, is very seductive indeed. It fortifies social arrangements, offers a rhetorical advantage in disputes, and makes life easier psychologically. These are considerations well worth keeping in mind as we proceed to consider the specific issue of competition. On arguments for the inevitability of competition. Competition is cited as part of human nature, as often as any other characteristic, so one might expect that there is quite a bit of argument and evidence to substantiate this claim. Amazingly, a careful examination of the literature turns up virtually nothing. The inevitability of competition is either tacitly assumed or simply asserted as if it were obvious. I want to examine these assertions in the writings of people who are favorably inclined toward competition before going on to review the evidence against its inevitability. Among those thinkers who believe competition is unavoidable are the authors of two of the classic works on play, Roger Caillas and Johann Huizinga. Both take it for granted that we are unavoidably competitive creatures. Games discipline instincts and institutionalize them. Caillas wrote that these competitive tendencies merit the status of instincts he did not bother to defend. For his part, Huizinga treated play and competition as virtually interchangeable. The possibility of non-competitive play literally would not occur to someone who believes competition is part of our nature. In their 1917 essay on the subject, John Harvey and his co-authors observed that, for many people, in games the pleasure comes from the competition itself, and not from success. From this they quickly concluded that there is therefore in human nature an instinct of pure competition which finds satisfaction in the very act of striving to do something better than other people, even though the attempt is not successful. This is rather like claiming that because many people prefer the car ride to the arrival at their destination, humans must have an instinctive attraction to automobile travel. The sociologist James S. Coleman, in his investigation of American high schools 25 years ago, employed equally dubious logic. He declared, "The removal of scholastic achievement as a basis of comparison does not lessen the amount of competition among adolescents. It only shifts the arena from academic matters to non-academic ones." He illustrates the latter with the competition between two girls for the attention of a boy. That competition is not restricted to the academic arena is surely true, but this hardly substantiates Coleman's implicit assumption that a set level of competitiveness exists in us willy-nilly and the best we can do is to rechannel, displace, it to this object or that. One of the very few recent book-length treatments of competition is Harvey Rubin's self-help manual, Competing, the first sentence of which is, "Competition is an inescapable fact of life." This, we later learn, is because we indeed have a competitive code in our chromosomes. An astonishing claim that is not substantiated or even explained. Rubin evidently believes we are genetically programmed to compete on the grounds that competition is very widespread and that we begin competing very early in life. Although they are not defended, these, at least, are reasons one might suppose competition is part of human nature. Somewhat more common, however, are rhetorical tricks and even name-calling as a way of justifying this assumption. Rubin's chief modus operandi is to define a wide range of behaviors as indirectly competitive, and thus effectively define a non-competitive orientation out of existence. For example, whether the child realizes it or not, learning to wait for a feeding while mother attends to another sibling is one of the first competitive lessons. And again, people who seem the least competitive of all types actually have only adopted more circuitous strategies to get what the others strive for more obviously. In subsequent chapters, we are told that all acts of comparison, as well as the act of joining a group, are intrinsically competitive behaviors. This model tells us more about its creator than about the world he purports to describe. It also sets up an unfalsifiable argument. Whereas any example of a non-competitive individual or culture should be sufficient to disprove the idea that competition is part of human nature, Rubin has arranged things so that even many such examples will not suffice. He has denied the very possibility of acting non-competitively, and so proved its inevitability. Because Rubin frames his argument at such length, it is easy to see what he is doing. More commonly, though, a writer will make a brief comment about competition that seems persuasive but actually rests on the same conceptual sleight of hand. Sometimes people are inclined to hide their competitive instincts and drives, writes Harold J. van der Zwaag. But when they participate in sport, their competitive nature is usually revealed. Translation: people are competitive on some occasions and not on other occasions. Therefore, the former is real and the latter is an instance of disguise. Here, too, the argument is laid out so no amount of empirical evidence can possibly disprove the hypothesis that competition is inevitable. Some writers have resorted to ad hominem attacks on those who question the naturalness of competition. I think we're all scared to face the competitive side of our nature, comments Marian O'Rourke in an article entitled, "Competition Isn't a Dirty Word." This neatly puts anyone who challenges the inevitability of competition in the position of being frightened, of lacking the courage to grasp a difficult but obvious truth. The well-known biologist Garrett Hardin goes further, becoming rather snide. In fact, we are not surprised to note that young people whose needs are taken care of by their elders often fail to appreciate the inevitability of competition. What is surprising is that adults whose specialty is the behavior of human beings in groups, sociologists, should hold competition in such low esteem. Besides blurring the issues of inevitability and desirability, Hardin pronounces himself unwilling to consider that these upstart social scientists may be on to something. The slam at privileged youth, however, is actually more interesting than it first appears. Put plainly, Hardin's point is that people who have not had to compete believe that competition is avoidable. But what if such people are correct? If we generalize the meaning of having one's needs taken care of, we are left with the provocative suggestion that competition exists not because it is in our nature but because of economic or psychological deficits that are, in principle, remediable. I have not carefully selected these examples of unjustified assertion, rhetorical trickery, and name-calling as straw men. They virtually exhaust the available literature. I have not been able to discover any other explicit arguments for the inevitability of human competition. Let me therefore turn to the opposing position. There are, broadly speaking, two general responses to the claim that competition is an inevitable feature of human life. 1. Cooperation is at least as integral to human life as competition, and 2. Competition is a learned phenomenon. I will begin with the first and return to the second later in this chapter. The respects in which other species and nature, as a whole, are cooperative will be examined in the next section. But there is a good case to be made that we regularly underestimate the role that cooperation plays in human life. We attend instead to the far more visible instances of struggle. The truth is that the vast majority of human interaction, in our society as well as in all other societies, is not competitive but cooperative interaction, according to educational psychologists David and Roger Johnson. Ashley Montagu has been arguing this for quite some time. Without the cooperation of its members, society cannot survive, and the society of man has survived because the cooperativeness of its members made survival possible. Arguably, the ubiquity of cooperative interactions even in a relatively competitive society is powerful evidence against the generalization that humans are naturally competitive. Our lives are promotively interdependent, to use Morton Deutsch's language, by the very fact of living and working together. This is true in every society. It is inherent in the very idea of society. If not simply false, the claim that we are unavoidably competitive is therefore a truth so partial as to be utterly misleading. This tendency to cooperate, to work actively with rather than against others, has been found among toddlers and even infants. So-called prosocial behaviors, cooperating, helping, sharing, comforting, and so on, occur in almost every child, even though research in this area has been practically non-existent until very recently. Regular examples of children under 3 years of age giving their toys to playmates, spontaneously taking turns in games, and so on must give pause to anyone who assumes competitiveness is the natural state of the human. I am not trying to suggest by this that it is human nature to help others. The problems with such claims have been raised earlier, and what is good for the competitive goose is good for the cooperative gander. One pair of researchers explicitly disavows this conclusion, in fact, arguing that prosocial behaviors result from experience, they are learned. But from wherever such inclination to help derives, it exists literally from the beginning of life. While we may not be unavoidably cooperative, we are, at worst, not unavoidably anything at all. The real state of nature. In considering the relative prevalence of competition and cooperation, we now turn to the natural world. In doing so, we find ourselves in what seems unfriendly territory. In fact, competition in the animal world is often cited as powerful evidence that competition is part of our nature, too. Before looking more closely at the evidence, however, we need to challenge the assumption that the proper study of mankind is animals. Even if other species were as competitive as some people think, this, like any fact about other species, has at best a very limited relevance to ourselves. As Marshall Solons, Richard Lewontin, and other critics of sociobiology have shown, and it should not be necessary to rehearse here, the mediating force of culture puts our species in a class by itself. Only humankind manipulates symbols, reflects upon the fact of its reflecting, questions, makes value judgments, appreciates absurdity, creates institutions, and then considers their limitations. Because of this, the historian Richard Hofstadter was absolutely correct to insist that judgments as to the value of competition between men or enterprises or nations must be based upon social and not allegedly biological consequences. But let us, for the sake of the argument, grant some relevance to the question: how does nature operate? From my own exposure to documentaries and popular conception, a series of images has lodged itself in my mind. Two powerful and deliberate males of an uncertain species are locked in mortal combat, while the feminine prize coolly sits on the sidelines. A huge fish swims up behind a smaller version of itself, jaws wide open. A fierce feline gracefully turns its less swift-footed cousin into steak. Some ignominiously vanquished species lies collectively rotting, while the victors are just off camera having lunch. This, I had always assumed, was the real state of nature, somewhere just beyond the tranquil loveliness of a spring day in the forest. All was red in tooth and claw. At this very moment, animals from paramecia to hippopotami are vigorously organizing themselves into winners and losers. As a humanist, in one sense of the word, I was dismayed at this picture of the natural world. As a humanist, in another sense, I was in no position to challenge its accuracy. Of course, the picture is not without its element of truth. Obviously, the scenes I saw on television actually happened. I was not, after all, watching highly paid stunt wolves. Still, as some biologists have been pointing out since the turn of the century, the animal world is not what many of us assume. To understand why this is so, let us consider the idea of natural selection, one of the greatest conceptual advances in the history of human thought. This theory states that the better adapted a species is to its environment, and specifically, to changes in that environment, the greater the probability of its being around in the future. To adapt is to be able to procreate is to survive. So much is uncontroversial. For many years, though, some biologists and ethologists have encouraged the widespread conception that natural selection is tantamount to competition. Survival of the fittest, to use the term coined not by Darwin but by Herbert Spencer, seemed to connote a struggle. Winners live to fight another day. In fact, there is no necessary relationship between natural selection and competitive struggle. As Stephen Jay Gould put it recently, the equation of competition with success in natural selection is merely a cultural prejudice. Success defined as leaving more offspring can be attained by a large variety of strategies, including mutualism and symbiosis, that we could call cooperative. There is no a priori preference in the general statement of natural selection for either competitive or cooperative behavior. Gould's point is that there is nothing about evolution that requires competition. And indeed, Darwin himself made clear that he was using the term struggle for existence in a large and metaphorical sense, including dependence of one being upon another. But what do we find in practice? Surprisingly, natural selection usually occurs without any discernible struggle, those exciting documentaries notwithstanding. According to the late George Gaylord Simpson, struggle is sometimes involved, but it usually is not, and when it is, it may even work against rather than toward natural selection. Advantage in differential reproduction is usually a peaceful process in which the concept of struggle is really irrelevant. It more often involves such things as better integration into the ecological situation, maintenance of a balance of nature, more efficient utilization of available food, better care of the young, elimination of intragroup discords, struggles that might hamper reproduction, exploitation of environmental possibilities that are not the objects of competition or are less effectively exploited by others. Natural selection does not require competition, on the contrary, it discourages it. Survival generally demands that individuals work with rather than against each other, and this includes others of the same species as well as those from different species. If this is true, and if natural selection is the engine of evolution, the central theme of nature, as it were, then we should expect to find animals cooperating with each other in great numbers. And so we do. It was Petr Kropotkin, in his 1902 book Mutual Aid, who first detailed the ubiquity of cooperation among animals. After reviewing the habits of species ranging from ants to bison, he concluded that competition is limited among animals to exceptional periods. Better conditions are created by the elimination of competition by means of mutual aid and mutual support. Don't compete. Competition is always injurious to the species, and you have plenty of resources to avoid it. That is the tendency of nature, not always realized in full, but always present. That is the watchword which comes to us from the bush, the forest, the river, the ocean. Therefore combine, practice mutual aid. That is what nature teaches us. 50 years later, W.C. Hawley reaffirmed this principle in his book Cooperation Among Animals. Montague, meanwhile, accumulated an impressive bibliography of other scientists who were coming to the same conclusion. Zoologist Marvin Bates is representative of these writers. This competition, this struggle, is a superficial thing, superimposed on an essential mutual dependence. The basic theme in nature is cooperation rather than competition, a cooperation that has become so all-pervasive, so completely integrated, that it is difficult to untwine and follow out the separate strands. It is in the interest of both individuals, or species, if they do not compete over, say, a watering hole. Migration is one of many strategies that will allow both parties to survive. Notice, though, that these writers are saying not only that animals tend to avoid competition, but that their behavior is overwhelmingly characterized by its opposite, cooperation. A question suggests itself at this point. If the accuracy of this view is so widely accepted in the scientific community, if Kropotkin wrote so early and is still recognized as having been on the right track, what accounts for the widespread acceptance of the Hobbesian-Spencerian picture? Why does the idea of a cooperative nature seem surprising to so many of us? There are several answers. First, cooperation is not always plain to the eye, whereas competition can readily be observed. As Hawley put it, lapwings protect other birds from predators. Baboons and gazelles work together to sense danger, the former watching, the latter listening and smelling. Chimpanzees hunt cooperatively and share the spoils. Pelicans fish cooperatively. Indeed, the production of oxygen by plants and carbon dioxide by animals could be said to represent a prototype for the cooperative interaction that becomes more pronounced and deliberate in the higher species. None of this, however, makes good television. It is easy to ignore an arrangement that does not call attention to itself. Second, there is some ambiguity about the language involved. Following Darwin, some biologists and zoologists use competition in its metaphorical sense, referring to nothing more than natural selection. If we find only one species remaining in a given area where there once were several, we might describe the winnowing process as competition. In itself, this is unobjectionable, provided that we keep in mind that this is not a matter of observation or even inference, but rather of definition. We are using the word in such a way that this scenario is competition. But this becomes problematic when we confuse the two meanings of competition, this broad, almost trivial sense, which describes all living things, and the narrower sense that refers to an intentional attempt to best another. Such a confusion can be exploited, as I suspect Garrett Hardin does, to argue for the inevitability of competition in human life. It's an ingenious syllogism, of a type that often has been used to draw fallacious conclusions. 1. The natural world is inherently competitive, sense 1. 2. Humans are competitive, sense 2. 3. Therefore, human competition is also inherent. There is a third explanation for why we consistently regard nature as competitive, and overlook the compelling evidence of mutual aid. This lies in the common tendency of the observer to project himself onto the observed, a tendency that explains the remarkable similarities between gods, Hebraic, Hellenic, and otherwise, and the people who wrote about them. John A. Wiens, a biologist, lays out considerable evidence to suggest that competition is not the ubiquitous force that many ecologists have believed, and asks, why then have they been so preoccupied with competition? His answer: competition occupies a central position in Western culture. Witness its expression in sports, economics, space exploration, international politics, or warfare. Little wonder, then, that community ecologists expected that the primary factor organizing communities would be competition. The very transmutation of natural selection into competition, of differential reproduction into exploitation, reflects the tendency to shape biological theories according to socioeconomic biases. Unconsciously, we understand nature to be just like ourselves. Then these biological theories, congealed into an account of how the natural world really is, are used to legitimate cultural practices. Consciously, we use nature to justify ourselves. Several thinkers have caught on to this, but the clearest statement was offered in 1875 by Frederick Engels. The whole Darwinist teaching of the struggle for existence is simply a transference from society to living nature of Hobbes's doctrine of bellum omnium contra omnes, a war of all against all, and of the bourgeois economic doctrine of competition together with Malthus's theory of population. When this conjurer's trick has been performed, the same theories are transferred back again from organic nature into history, and it is now claimed that their validity as eternal laws of human society has been proved. I began this section by noting that data concerning animals have a limited relevance for humans. Let me close with this qualification: if we are concerned about our own collective survival, the natural world may have something to teach us after all. Its lesson is that cooperation generally has far more survival value than competition. This, as Darwin recognized, is particularly true for human beings. Montague summed up the case: in so far as man is concerned, if competition, in its aggressive combative sense, ever had any adaptive value among men, which is greatly to be doubted, it is quite clear that it has no adaptive value whatever in the modern world. Perhaps never before in the history of man has there been so high a premium upon the adaptive value of cooperative behavior. Such a prescription, however, anticipates later chapters simply by virtue of being a prescription. Here our task is only to consider whether competition is inevitable in human life, and the very idea that we ought to minimize it rests on the assumption that we can, hence, that it is not inevitable. Learning competition or cooperation. From the prevalence of cooperation, we turn now to the other major argument against claims of inevitability, the contention that competition is learned. A tour of the literature through many disciplines makes it clear that the great majority of theorists and researchers who have investigated competition have concluded that the competitive orientation is indeed learned. Theoretically, and, As we shall soon see, practically, too, what is learned can be unlearned. The first comprehensive investigation of the topic was the 1937 study sponsored by the Social Science Research Council. Mark A. May and Leonard Dubé reported 24 specific findings based on the existing knowledge represented by the survey of the literature of the field. The first of which was this: human beings by original nature strive for goals, but striving with others, cooperation, or against others, competition, are learned forms of behavior. Neither of these two, they continued, can be said to be the more genetically basic, fundamental, or primordial. This conclusion has withstood half a century of study across several fields. The father of modern research on competition in social psychology, Morton Deutsch, of Columbia University, wrote in 1973 that it would be unreasonable to assume there is an innately determined human tendency for everyone to want to be top dog. Sports psychologists Thomas Tutko and William Bruns agreed, basing their opinion on considerable experience with athletes of all ages. Competition is a learned phenomenon. People are not born with a motivation to win or to be competitive. We inherit a potential for a degree of activity, and we all have the instinct to survive. But the will to win comes through training and the influences of one's family and environment. As the song in South Pacific says, "You've got to be carefully taught." In the United States, we are carefully taught, and the result is that, accepting the kind of invisible cooperation that is required for any society to run, Americans appear to be uniquely uncooperative as a people. David Reisman, the eminent sociologist, found an interesting irony in the paradoxical belief of Americans that competition is natural, but only if it is constantly recreated by artificial systems of social roles that direct energies into it. First, we are systematically socialized to compete, and to want to compete, and then the results are cited as evidence of competition's inevitability. Consider the dimensions of that socialization. For 2 centuries, writes psychologist Elliot Aronson, our educational system has been based upon competitiveness. If you are a student who knows the correct answer and the teacher calls on one of the other kids, it is likely that you will sit there hoping and praying the kid will come up with the wrong answer so that you will have a chance to show the teacher how smart you are. Indeed, children's peers are their enemies, to be beaten. The message that competition is appropriate, desirable, required, and even unavoidable is drummed into us from nursery school to graduate school. It is the subtext of every lesson. The late Jules Henry, who turned his keen anthropologist's eye to our own culture, made this strikingly clear. Boris had trouble reducing 12/16 to the lowest terms, and could only get as far as 6/8. The teacher asked him quietly if that was as far as he could reduce it. She suggested he think. Much heaving up and down and waving of hands by the other children, all frantic to correct him. Boris pretty unhappy, probably mentally paralyzed. She then turns to the class and says, "Well, who can tell Boris what the number is?" A forest of hands appears, and the teacher calls Peggy. Peggy says that 4 may be divided into the numerator and the denominator. Thus Boris's failure has made it possible for Peggy to succeed. His depression is the price of her exhilaration, his misery the occasion for her rejoicing. This is the standard condition of the American elementary school. To a Zuni, Hopi, or Dakota Indian, Peggy's performance would seem cruel beyond belief. Something far more significant and lasting than fractions is being taught here. Boris will likely grow up despising the Peggys he encounters, perhaps fanning that wrath until it takes in all women or some other group that seems to include too many winners. Perhaps he will be unequal to the demands of active rage and will simply slink through life a confirmed failure. In any case, he and Peggy will take from this classroom a common lesson. Other people are not partners but opponents, not potential friends but rivals. In a hyper-competitive society, it is never too early to begin such training. Most recently, readiness programs have appeared to prepare infants for the feverish competition at the better nursery schools. By the time of elementary school, the pressure to be number 1 is nothing new, but it has just begun to be codified and quantified. A first grader may be crushed, for instance, if her homework assignment is stamped with a smile face while others receive a smile face and a very good. Eventually, this ranking takes the form of grades. Educational achievement, writes Morton Deutsch, is measured so as to conform to an assumed underlying distribution. The social context of most educational measurement is that of a contest in which students are measured primarily in comparison with one another rather than in terms of objective criteria of accomplishment. Where in this carefully designed laboratory of competition can a child even sample cooperative achievement? In fact, most teachers misunderstand the very word cooperation. They use it to refer to obedience. To cooperate is to follow instructions. We have another word for genuine cooperative effort. As several writers have pointed out, it is cheating. When class is over, the lesson continues. Children are taught that all games must have a winner and a loser. As Peter and Bridget Berger have written, it is only very young children who sometimes wish, wistfully, that everyone should win. They soon learn that this is impossible. In American society, that is, for there are other societies in which children actually play games in which everyone wins. The idea that everyone can win evokes condescending smiles, and it doesn't take long before these children come to accept the naturalness of competition. Here is Jean Piaget, in his classic work The Moral Judgment of the Child, questioning 6-year-old Mar. Who has won? We've both won. But who has won most? Piaget is not only learning from his young informant, but also teaching him. The inculcation of competition in the classroom and on the playing field is a source of unending frustration to some parents. Fathers and mothers who would prefer that their children learn to work with rather than against others can do only so much to foster this value, since they do not raise their children in a vacuum. Even determinately liberated parents must contend with an elaborate competitive structure outside the home that will frustrate their best efforts at education. Out there, doing one's best means triumphing over others. This is the same struggle that defines parents' attempts to steer their children away from sexism or violence, or mindless obedience, or unhealthful foods, or any number of other things sanctioned by our society. Such a clash between the parents and the rest of the culture is exceptional, however. The family generally is an efficient vehicle by which societal norms are transmitted, not a holdout against these norms. Most parents raise children according to the values by which they were raised, and this process perpetuates the larger culture in which it occurs. From our very earliest days, we are busily absorbing an uncritical acceptance of competition. We are being primed for the classroom and the workplace. As we grow, the socialization in the home continues to work hand in glove with the socialization outside the home. There is pressure to make our parents proud, by being not merely good, but better than others, at schoolwork, sports, and almost any other activity in which we take part. If Dad, in his day, had the highest batting average in school, then we must do likewise. If Dad was not a superlative athlete, then we must distinguish ourselves anyway. Our task is to provide vicarious gratification. If our parents never got very far in school, we must not merely take advantage of the chances they never had. We must be the very best of students. Examples of such pressure can be multiplied indefinitely. Of course, some parents, who sport newly raised consciousnesses, may proudly declare to any who will listen that they ask of Bobby only that he do his best. But this official posture surely does not fool Bobby. He is fully aware that doing his best is a code that means beating his peers. As a result of their own training, most parents, even if sincere, still communicate subliminal messages of disappointment with anything other than victory. But the family does not merely encourage and sustain competition in the outside world, it manufactures its very own brand. This is particularly true in the nuclear family, which, let us remember, is not the only possible arrangement for child rearing. One series of field studies in the South Pacific found that greater rivalrous responses occurred in children brought up in Western-type small nuclear families rather than the traditional extended families. How does this happen? First, many parents carefully, though often unconsciously, direct a drama of sibling rivalry on the stage of their own homes. Even competition booster Harvey Rubin is appalled by the divide and conquer theory of parenting, whereby children who are set against each other are easier to discipline. Setting up an insidious race to become mommy's favorite mostly benefits mommy. It gets the dishes dried, for one thing. But far more important are the emotional rewards for parents who are every bit as much in need of approval, affection, and support as their children, and in many cases, unfortunately, they are able to get this most easily by nourishing divisiveness within the home. In some homes, it is the parents who compete for their children's love. Whom do you love more? Is seldom asked aloud, but parental behavior often seems motivated by this concern. The intrinsic sickness of this family pattern, like the terrible consequences for all concerned, will not be considered here. My point is only that such dynamics foster competition. We grow up thinking of love as a scarce commodity, the prize in a desperate contest that we will enter again and again. We associate being loved with winning a race, and this happens partly because of the very language with which we have heard affection expressed. Who's the best little girl in the whole wide world? Beyond love, we will generalize the need to be number one, taking competition with us to any and all arenas. The process of socializing children to be competitive is sometimes tacit. Few parents, for example, sit their child down and say, "Now, Stephen, it's time you learn that you can't have a good time unless you set things up so one side wins and the other loses." This attitude is taught by example. On the other hand, the idea that people attain excellence exclusively in a competitive setting, that no one would be motivated to work in a non-competitive economic system, is something we often hear in just so many words. Even more common are expressions of the belief that one has no choice but to be competitive. Competition is an unavoidable feature of human life, so you might as well get used to it right away. Some parents may sincerely believe this, but others feel conflicted and vaguely guilty about their own competitiveness. If they convince themselves, and teach their children, that one can't help being competitive, they can live more easily with themselves. This belief in competition's inevitability may be insupportable for all the reasons discussed in this chapter, but it soon takes on the shape of a classic self-fulfilling prophecy. By teaching children to act in a way that is said to be inevitable, we make the practice inevitable and so make the proposition true. This may well be the heart of the socialization process. To complicate matters further, competition seems to be self-perpetuating. In his long career of studying conflict, and more generally, social interaction, Deutsch has found that any given mode of interaction breeds more of itself. Specifically, the experience of cooperation will induce a benign spiral of increasing cooperation, while competition will induce a vicious spiral of intensifying competition. Quite a bit of research on the so-called prisoner's dilemma, PD, game, in which players choose whether to cooperate or defect, has confirmed this. Moreover, Harold H. Kelly and Anthony J. Stahelski's PD experiments found that people who generally are cooperative tend to resemble competitive individuals when they must deal with them. Competition, we might say, cannibalizes cooperation. And what of those who already incline toward competition? Why do they persist in their ways? Kelly and Stahelski found that whereas cooperative individuals realistically perceive that some people are cooperative like themselves while others are competitive, competitive individuals believe that virtually everyone else is also competitive. Thus we have another self-fulfilling prophecy. Competitive people, falsely, assume that all others share their orientation, and indeed, those who declare most vociferously that it's a dog-eat-dog world out there, usually are responsible for more than their share of canine consumption, which impels them to redouble their own competitive orientation. This finding has been replicated by several other researchers. Both the desirability of competition and the strategies for implementing it, then, are taught to us from our earliest days. This orientation then reproduces itself. What is peculiar, as Reisman pointed out, is that we should have to contrive such a thorough program of socialization if competition really were part of human nature. Typically it is those who argue most strenuously for the latter who are, at the same time, vigorously promoting this training process. Far more plausible is the hypothesis that all of this training is not superfluous. We compete only because we have learned to do so. In order to prove this hypothesis correct rather than simply arguing for its plausibility, one would need some evidence that children can be taught to cooperate. If they take to this approach, learn it easily, enjoy it, continue using it, it would be evident that competition is not inevitable. Longitudinal studies of this kind have not been performed, to my knowledge, unless one regards cross-cultural data as naturalistic evidence along these lines. However, some work in early childhood education comes close. A few years ago, Gerald Sygotsky and his colleagues at Adelphi University successfully trained 118 pairs of first through third grade students to cooperate in a series of classroom games. This was done through a combination of direct instruction and modeling, having them watch someone else be reinforced for engaging in the desired behavior. About 7 weeks later, a new experimenter tried a new game with these children and found a significant retention and generalization of the cooperative approach, particularly among the older children. Overall, the study indicates that a relatively brief and straightforward intervention can effectively train cooperation. Similar generalization has been reported on the part of 5th graders and, in still another study, 3rd graders. Earlier and more primitive research found that children continued behaving cooperatively even when reinforcement was briefly withdrawn. More recently, Aronson not only had remarkable success with a cooperative learning technique but also discovered that teachers continued to use it years after the experiment was over. Deutsch reported that adults, too, taught themselves to cooperate when the game they were playing rewarded such behavior. A somewhat more anecdotal account of this effect is provided by David N. Campbell, who reports on his visit to an unnamed British elementary school. When another American teacher on the tour asked these children who was the smartest among them, they didn't know what he was talking about. They had evidently never thought about it. There were no putbacks, grades, tests, gold stars. All stories and drawings were displayed on the walls. Children were not placed in failure situations, forced to prove themselves, to read at grade level every week. When he returned home, Campbell resolved to make his own classroom less competitive. It required only about 3 weeks for the changes to emerge, he continues. The first was an end to the destruction of others' work. Later, a spirit of cooperation and help began to be common. Finally, there was what I look for as the real measure of success: children talking freely to every adult and stranger who walks in, leading them by the hand to see projects and explaining their activities, no longer afraid, suspicious, or turned inward. Such changed attitudes developed because we stopped labeling and rank ordering. Some of the most interesting work with recreational cooperation has been done by Terry Orlick at the University of Ottawa. After leading children from preschool age to 2nd grade in cooperative games, he found a 3-fold to 4-fold increase in the incidence of cooperative behavior when the children were later left to play by themselves. Control groups, meanwhile, tended to become more competitive as the year progressed. Orlick also found that children reported being happier playing cooperative games. Given the choice, 2/3 of the 9 and 10-year-old boys and all of the girls would prefer to play games where neither side loses rather than games where one side wins and the other side loses. In the classroom, meanwhile, 65% of a group of 6th graders said they preferred a cooperative learning structure. The total sample here was divided evenly between those who tended to attribute their successes or failures to themselves, internalizers, and those who attributed consequences to fate or other people, externalizers. Significantly, a majority of both groups preferred cooperative learning. As of 1984, a pair of researchers were able to cite 7 studies showing a preference for cooperative over competitive or independent experiences. I am aware of no studies that found a preference for competition over cooperation, providing the subjects had experienced the latter in some fashion. This qualification is critical. It is not unusual for people to say they prefer to compete but then to change their minds when they see at first hand what it is like to learn or work or play in an environment that does not require winners and losers. This, incidentally, has been found to be true of college students too. The evidence seems persuasive, then, that children can learn to cooperate and, when given a choice, seem to prefer this cooperative arrangement. The evidence is far less clear, however, on the question of how old children must be in order to learn to cooperate. The traditional position, following Piaget's developmental schedule, is that children cannot cooperate or compete in any meaningful way until they are about 6 or 7 years old and have reached the operational stage. This position is compatible with the usual movement of children toward increasing competitiveness. What precedes competition, it is argued, is not positive cooperation but merely the absence of competition, two very different things, or, for that matter, the absence of any sophisticated goal-directed activity. The ability to cooperate and to compete are said to develop around the same time. The fact that very young children do not compete, then, is not terribly significant. Young children do not have body hair either, but that doesn't mean that body hair is a learned phenomenon. On the other hand, the fact that children normally become more competitive as they grow older also means very little because most children have not been exposed to models of cooperative interaction. Yet not everyone is agreed that young children cannot cooperate. Spontaneous prosocial behavior takes place in infants, as we saw before. Anna Freud observed 19-month-old toddlers building a tower together, taking turns adding blocks. This could mean that Piaget and his followers are wrong. But even if we insist that such collaborative or helping behaviors do not qualify as genuine cooperation, there is evidence that children of only 4 or 5, past the toddler stage but not yet operational, can indeed be taught to cooperate. In fact, Orlick has found young children to be most receptive to cooperative ventures and cooperative challenges. He proposes that this is true because the younger the child, the less time he has had in the competitive mainstream of our society, and therefore the more willing he is to accept cooperative games. Millard C. Madsen's research seems to support Orlick's view, at least within this country. In presenting an experimental problem that required a cooperative solution, he found that more younger than older children are successful in solving the problem in such a way as to maximize reward. Sygotsky, on the other hand, found that older children, 7 or 8-year-olds, learn to cooperate more readily than younger ones, which is what Piagetian theory would predict. But all of these researchers agree, and the whole of this section confirms, that cooperation can be learned. Thus, competition is by no means inevitable. Life in other cultures. Even in the era of the global village, as Marshall McLuhan characterized the interdependence of the modern world, ethnocentrism remains. It is present in two forms: as a value judgment that unfamiliar cultural practices are ipso facto inferior. If it's different, it's worse. And as an empirical belief that what is present in one's own land must be universal. If it's here, it's everywhere. I am concerned with the latter, and specifically with the assumption, usually unstated, that because competition is so pervasive in these parts it must be pervasive everywhere. If this assumption is wrong, then competition is learned and it is not inevitable. In Chapter 1, I suggested that the United States appears to be uniquely competitive. This observation also has been made by researchers who have observed other cultures and or tested their inhabitants. Anthropologists Beatrice and John Whiting recorded the frequency of such acts as touching, reprimanding, offering help, insulting, and so on, in 6 cultures, one of which was in the United States, a small New England town. As a proportion of total acts observed, the latter scored lowest on offering help. Another researcher compared the way people in 4 Scandinavian countries, England, and the United States described child-rearing orientations and norms of masculinity in their respective nations. On both subjects, she found a far greater emphasis on competition in the United States. In experiments with Anglo-American and Mexican children, 2 psychologists discovered that the former tended to remain in conflict even when to do so prevented them from getting as many toys as possible, a tendency that was rightly characterized as irrational competition. When permitted to do so, these children also took away another child's toy even though they had nothing to gain from this act. These data concerning the competitiveness of Americans are particularly useful because they are being contrasted with findings from other cultures. Let us now examine some of these other cultures in greater detail by turning to the reports of anthropologists and other cross-cultural observers. The United States, as we shall see, is appreciably more competitive than many other cultures. In fact, some cultures appear to be entirely non-competitive. Consider first the case of primitive cultures, which many people, relying on caricatured images of growling cavemen, associate with fierce competition. As with ideas about the animal world, this perception is largely mistaken. Prehistoric people actually were remarkably cooperative, and in fact may have distinguished themselves from other primates precisely by virtue of the extent of their cooperativeness. A growing number of anthropologists are concluding that cooperation, not brain size or the use of tools, and certainly not aggressiveness, defined the first humans. The distinguished biologist George Egenpue wrote, "Primitive human societies differ greatly from other primates in the amount of cooperation that is achieved. Within primitive human societies, sharing is a way of life. This sharing is not limited to food, but extends to all types of resources. The practical result is that scarce resources are shared within the societies approximately in proportion to need. Through the medium of kinship, early humans developed cooperative arrangements that, according to Marshall Solins, were apparently mandated by virtue of the conditions of life." In his words, "The emerging human primate, in a life and death economic struggle with nature, could not afford the luxury of a social struggle. Cooperation, not competition, was essential. Hobbes's famous fantasy of a war of all against all in the natural state could not be further from the truth." 85 Substantiation for this conclusion is provided by extant hunter-gatherer societies, such as the Congo Pygmies, Kalahari Bushmen, Australian Aborigines, and the Guaranis of the Amazon, all of which are overwhelmingly cooperative. The fact that some of these cultures still exist today invites a wider consideration of contemporary non-competitive societies that cast our own competitiveness into sharp relief. It was Margaret Mead and her associates who first attended to this characteristic, cooperation and competition among primitive peoples. 1937 described several such cultures in some detail. These include the Zhui Indians. The orientations of all institutions, with little exception, to a basic principle of cooperative, non-individualistic behavior is the pattern of Zunai culture. Possession of material goods is not seen as desirable. Wealth circulates freely, and there is therefore no competition in the economic sphere. The major recreation cum religious ritual is a ceremonial formal foot race. Anyone can participate, the winner receives no special recognition, and his name is not even announced. In fact, someone who has consistently won is prevented from running. The Iroquois Indians. Beyond the degree of cooperation required to achieve the greatest efficiency in production, there was found, especially in agricultural activity, cooperation for the purpose of experiencing the pleasures of group work. The Bathanga. Bathanga society is highly cooperative within the bounds of the village, and in all other social and economic relations it is essentially non-competitive. In economic organization, in technology, in social relations little range is given to any expression of competition. On the basis of a dozen cultural studies that comprise the book, Mead writes that the most basic conclusion which comes out of this research is that competitive and cooperative behavior on the part of individual members of a society is fundamentally conditioned by the total social emphasis of that society, that the goals for which individuals will work are culturally determined and are not the response of the organism to an external, culturally undefined situation. Cross-cultural research in this vein has continued and expanded in the half-century since Mead's study was published. This research substantiates her conclusion by documenting significant differences in competitiveness among people of different cultures. Consider, Blackfoot Indian children cooperated far more effectively than urban Canadian children in a series of experimental games, and this occurred whether they were being rewarded collectively or individually. Israeli kibbutz children cooperated far more effectively than urban Israeli children, the latter being unable to stop their irrational competition, even though they obviously realized this was not paying off for any of them. What's more, the kibbutzniks spontaneously arranged to divide their prizes equally among the members. In later experiments that replicated this result, Kibbutz groups characteristically demonstrated a high degree of organization, in sharp contrast to the unrestrained and unorganized tug of war that was typical of the city groups. Kikuyu children from Kenya cooperated more effectively than American children at an experimental game. Rural Mexican children were more cooperative than Mexican Americans, who were in turn more cooperative than Anglo-Americans. The latter, as noted above, tended to compete even when the situation was arranged to reward cooperation, and tended to take away another's toy for sheer spite twice as often as did the Mexican children. Americans often missed the cooperative solution, spontaneously declaring, "This game is too hard," or "No one can win." When asked after the experiment how they might have gotten some toys, competitive subjects most often responded, "If I could play alone, or if I could move more than once, not take turns moving." Among the reasons proposed for this significant cultural disparity is the fact that rural Mexican mothers tend to reinforce their children non-contingently, rewarding them whether they succeed or fail, whereas Anglo-American mothers tend to reinforce their children as a rigid function of the child's achievement. The idea that children should be accepted and loved unconditionally, rather than in proportion to the number of others they have beaten at something, is a very peculiar idea to many Americans. The Mexicans of Juxtlahuaca, Mexico, regard envy and competitiveness as a minor crime. The Tengu of New Guinea eschew competitive games, preferring one called take-tack in which two teams spin tops. The objective of the game is to reach an exact draw. The Inuit of Canada live with virtually no competitive structures. Their recreation, like their economic system, is cooperative. Australian Aborigines display a marked preference for cooperative action, and one experiment found that they cooperated just as readily with members of other tribes as with their own tribe members. Norwegians almost always responded in kind to cooperative behavior in an experimental game, whereas American subjects did so only about half the time. Japanese education is said to be far less competitive than ours. The Japanese have always been inventive in devising ways of avoiding direct competition. Ruth Benedict reported in the mid-1940s. Their elementary schools minimize it beyond what Americans would think possible. As of 1980, this was still the case. Teachers tried to create balanced groups composed of people with diverse abilities, and they encouraged the students to help each other. And from yet another source, in 1982, challenging problems are posed to entire classes, whose members are encouraged to talk to, and to help, one another and are allowed to make mistakes. At times, older children visit the classrooms and aid the younger ones. Chinese people, despite becoming more serious about sports and despite the recent introduction of a system encouraging academic competition, remain far more cooperative than Americans. Students say they prefer cooperative activities to competitive ones, and peer group norms approving helpfulness and the simple enjoyment of social rather than isolated studying often led students to cooperate even if they had to give more help than they received. These research summaries do not by any means constitute an exhaustive account of non-competitive societies or of the discrepant levels of competitiveness across different cultures. But even this brief survey should suggest that competition is a matter of social structure rather than human nature. Competition may be an integral part of certain institutions in contemporary Western society, such as capitalism, but it is clearly not an unavoidable consequence of life itself. The cross-cultural data allow for several generalizations. First, as must be obvious, rural children in all cultures studied are more cooperative in conflict of interest situations that require mutual assistance. And we may tentatively propose that urban living is generally associated with, if not causally related to, structural as well as intentional competition. This, of course, does not mean that all rural societies will be non-competitive or that all urban areas will be equally competitive. Second, competitive societies tend also to hurry their children toward adulthood, a feature of American society described and decried recently by several critics. Third, there is a remarkable correspondence between competitiveness in a society and the presence of clearly defined have and have not groups. This correlation between economic maldistribution and competition seems to fit with the findings of Mead et al. Concerning the absence of possessiveness and hoarding behavior in cooperative cultures. These studies also allow us to debunk several widely held assumptions about competition. First, there is no necessary relationship between competitiveness and achievement. That this is true on the individual level will be explored in detail in the next chapter. On the societal level, Roderick Gorney conducted a careful study of the research available on 58 cultures. He defined achievement as complex accomplishments in the arts, sciences, the law, and other fields, and found to his surprise that there was no significant relationship between achievement and competition. Second, competition is not a prerequisite for strong ego development, which is used by some psychologists as a shorthand expression for psychological health. Strong ego development can occur in individualistic, competitive, or cooperative societies, according to Mead's findings. In fact, competition's deleterious effect on self-esteem and health will be explored in Chapter 5. Finally, it is sometimes argued that cooperation is a luxury permitted in places or times of plenty. When resources are scarce, people are said to resort to competitive behavior. This is simply false. Mead and her colleagues found counterexamples of both types: competitive societies where there was an economy of abundance, e.g., the Kwakiutl Indians, and cooperative societies where there was an economy of scarcity, e.g., the Batiga of East Africa. It is the norms of the culture that determine its competitiveness, not the presence or absence of resources. As Mead put it, it is not the actual supply of a desired good which decrees whether or not the members of a society will compete for it or cooperate and share it, but it is the way the structure of the society is built up that determines whether individual members shall cooperate or shall compete with one another. In fact, Mead went further than this, suggesting at one point that the relative plenty in several societies was the result of their cooperative arrangements, not the cause. Put differently, cooperation can be seen as an appropriate, rational response to scarcity since it is probably more effective at maximizing what one has. This is what Marshall Solons was getting at on Greater Than Sign, and William O. Johnson put it even more bluntly. Pioneers were not competitive people, they were a cooperative people. They wouldn't have survived otherwise. To say that people naturally become competitive when there isn't enough to go around is not merely inaccurate, but a reflection of how easily we universalize our own cultural norms. Psychological arguments for inevitability. Anyone who accepts Freud's model of the personality and human development is likely to assume that competition is unavoidable. Even if Freud does not come out and say this explicitly, the implications of his thought are clear, so a few words about psychoanalytic theory are in order. In Freud's view, we begin life screaming for gratification, little more than a bundle of needs. This is how we leave life, too. Maturity consists only in learning to put off that gratification and reconfigure some of the needs. We remain self-centered creatures in search of pleasure. The ego always is in the service of the id. Moreover, men are not gentle creatures who want to be loved. They are, on the contrary, creatures among whose instinctual endowments is to be reckoned a powerful share of aggressiveness. According to this view, if I appear to be concerned about cooperating with others, you may safely assume that I have either 1. Cleverly figured out some way to use other people to my own ends and to make it look like cooperation, or 2. Unconsciously transformed my feelings of hostility into their opposite so as to keep these feelings out of my awareness. Other people are means to my own, primarily sexual, satisfaction or else rivals to be bested. Any appearances to the contrary represent the desperate attempt of culture to tame our base instincts. But this attempt is finally futile because instinctual passions are stronger than reasonable interests. Life, as Hobbes had written 3 centuries before, is nasty, brutish, and short, but for Freud there is no Hobbesian body politic to rescue us from this condition. Competition, in this view, is inevitable, of course. Its development is elaborated in the early parent-child relationship. A desire to win the parent's love can fuel endless competitive struggle. An internalization of the parent means that adults, with parents long dead, can still be driven to win for the same reason. Psychoanalysts also explicate competition, particularly among men. According to the Oedipal conflict, the opponent is always daddy, the prize mommy. To evince some reluctance to compete cannot be based on a rational decision. Ultimately, for the classical psychoanalyst, virtually nothing is. Rather, one is unconsciously anxious about the symbolic consequences of beating the father. In all, competition is natural and, like other drives, can be hidden or sublimated but never escaped. To attempt the latter is inadvisable, according to Anna Freud. Inhibition of exhibitionism, of curiosity, of aggression, of competition, etc., produces the same crippling effect on the individual's personality whether they occur early or late in life. To attempt a refutation of this position is to take on the very heart of Freudian thought, which is well beyond the scope of this book. Much of this chapter, however, is responsive to these assumptions, and the interested reader is referred to the writings of the ego psychologists, the neo-Freudians, particularly Karen Horney, and the humanistic psychologists. Even among psychoanalytically inclined psychiatrists, in fact, one can find chinks in the armor of inevitability. One rather obscure British psychoanalyst, Lon Sutty, sees competition as a manifestation of the search for the security and satisfaction of social integration, fellowship, rather than as an autonomous instinct. Following him, Roderick Gorney describes human development as a progression from being preponderantly dependent on others for survival to having others predominantly depend on us. Throughout our lives, he argues, we are involved in cooperation. To take another example, the psychiatrist Herbert Hendon talks about fathers who become involved with their sons in a way that cements them in competitive, anxiety-ridden situations or undermines their ability to become independent. The competitive work situations that constitute the major bond between such fathers and sons serve to create models for the son's future relations with men. The clear implication here is that the Oedipal prototype for competitive interaction can be traced to particular styles of child-rearing that are avoidable. These, of course, are minority reports, but however unfortunate the implications of psychoanalysis may be regarding the question of inevitability, its framework can be useful in exploring the relationship between competition and psychological health. See Chapter 5. Another argument for inevitability, drawn from social psychology, concerns the phenomenon of social comparison. Our identities are a function of our social world, others define who we are. Therefore, it is proposed, we are always in the process of comparing ourselves with others, and our behaviors and products with those of the people around us. This process is said to be particularly critical during childhood when our identities are quite literally being formed. It continues because social comparison tells us whether what we do is any good. The second step in this argument is that comparison implies competition. If I am looking over at you, I naturally will want to be better than you. Because of its familiarity and apparent plausibility, this argument demands a response. In fact, the very simplicity that makes it appealing also undermines its explanatory power. It is true that comparing what we do to what someone else does goes on all the time, but let us not assume that this is the only way to check how we are doing. As Rainer Martins wrote, to evaluate one's abilities, it is necessary to make a comparison between at least two elements, your own performance and some other standard. That can include another individual, a group, one's own past performance, or some idealized performance level. Notice how the second element does not have to be another person. It is true that an idealized performance level originally may have been derived from others' performances, but in practice neither of Martins's last two standards is experienced as competition. It is not a fact of human nature that a person's sense of competence or identity has to be derived from social comparison. It is instead a matter of what kind of task is being performed at the moment, and what kind of culture one lives in. The latter is especially important. Psychologist Albert Bandura observed that, in competitive, individualistic societies, where one person's success represents another person's failure, social comparison figures prominently in self-appraisal. In other societies, this is not necessarily the case. Consider Jerome Kagan's illustrations, the seminal experiences of this era, the years just prior to puberty, are those that persuade youth that they can successfully gain the prizes they want. A father in a cornfield teaching his 8-year-old son how to plant maize finds it easy to create a situation that will accomplish this goal. It is more difficult when the child is with one teacher in a class of 30 children. From the child's perspective, the private evaluation of progress is based primarily on a comparison of one's performance with that of one's peers. Most of us have spent more time in a crowded classroom than in a quiet cornfield, so we assume that our own situation is an unavoidable part of growing up. Even to the extent that one's esteem or sense of mastery initially is the result of comparing oneself with others, this may well be temporary, a developmental stage. While acknowledging that competition may well become the dominant basis of self-definition. In a highly competitive school system or neighborhood, Joseph Veroff adds, with adequate social comparison about valued characteristics, a person can relax about social comparison and move back into considering his own autonomous capacities for mastery. An adult with a reasonably healthy self-concept, in other words, does not need to continue asking ritualistically, "How am I doing?" or even to compare herself or himself with others. Interestingly, a number of psychologists have included autonomous self-evaluation in their definitions of psychological health. My intent up to this point has been to qualify the assumption that we all have to compare ourselves with others. The next step, then, will be to ask whether this comparison, when it does occur, necessitates competition. We can immediately see that the answer is no. I can compare my hobbies, or shoes or kitchen, with yours without feeling in the least that one is better than another. I may make the comparison with the intention of making sure I am not appreciably different from you. Social comparison may be geared toward conformity. But even when this is not the case, and even when the comparison is suffused with judgment, it does not follow that I must feel competitive with you. The Bathanga of South Africa, we are told, compare their fishing catches, but there is no indication that individuals strive to outdo one another. Closer to home, I may compare my own writing with Shakespeare's, or, for that matter, with that of a contemporary, and sense my own relative inferiority. This could motivate me to improve or, specifically, to emulate features of his writing that I admire. Neither of these means that I feel the need to become better than he. If you and I run together for recreation, your greater speed or endurance may help to improve my own without my ever trying to beat you. As John Harvey puts it, it is one thing to act from a desire to excel somebody else at something. It is quite another to act with a view to getting something done, and yet to be stimulated in the activity by the parallel or contrasted activity of others. To the proponent of competition who insists that differences in ability will always exist, then, we may reply that it is the significance invested in these differences and not the differences themselves that constitutes competition. The inability to observe discrepant abilities without turning the situation into a contest is a learned disposition. The degree of an individual's competitiveness can be expressed as a function of how frequently this happens and how strongly one feels the need to be better. But there is not a shred of evidence that this inclination is an unavoidable feature of human life. Even if it is true that both structural and intentional competition are far from inevitable, their pervasiveness in our society is a concrete and formidable barrier to change. We cannot make this society non-competitive by the end of the week, and this chapter should not be read as claiming such. At the same time, we should be on guard against the claim that competition is inherent in our culture. When it is contended that competition is destructive, some people will reply that there is nothing we can do about it, regardless of the existence of other non-competitive cultures. This tack has been used to argue against the possibility of changing any number of objectionable features in a society. It is another version of the self-fulfilling prophecy we encountered, and, to return to the subject of this chapter's opening, it is a profoundly conservative posture in its consequences, if not in its intention. Any example of people behaving non-competitively should, strictly speaking, have been enough to refute the human nature argument. But we are dealing with people here rather than with mathematical proofs, so it has been necessary to show that a non-competitive orientation, if not the deliberate practice of cooperation, is a serious possibility, a realistic alternative for our lives. That has been the point of this chapter. Now it is time to move from can to should. Since competition is not necessary, we are free to consider whether it is desirable.
Look at this guy. What are you gonna do, kid? Go home. It's hopeless. Yeah, dude, do something with your life. Leave. You're looking stupid, man. Give it up.